Recording is underway. So we're at the end of week 2 now. This is financial foundations. We've been talking about the economics, our definition for that. Talked about the Federal Reserve Bank and what they do with monetary policy. Tuesday, we talked a lot about taxation and government spending and how Congress and the president come up with a budget and handle the fiscal policy. Got to remember, fiscal is different than monetary policy. Different people are involved. It's a different concept. So today, we're going to talk about another really big concept in economics, and that's supply and demand. Going to look at some supply and demand graphs. Can be very helpful. We're going to talk about something called equilibrium. The big thing I want to emphasize right at the top here for supply and demand is you cannot talk about supply and demand without also talking about the price. Some of you guys have already jumped into the supply and demand assignment, which I was glad to see. So it must be something that some of you are pretty comfortable with already. That's great. Supply and demand has an effect on price. Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about something called the circular flow. Circular flow in the economy. Anybody heard that phrase before? Familiar with it? Well, the circular flow in the economy, it's about how money flows. So it's a fairly descriptive term. You got taxation, you got people earning money through their paychecks, you got people buying stuff. So there's all these exchanges of money. The money is flowing in different directions, right? So we as individuals, what do we have to sell? How do we get paid? Well, we offer our labor. What do we get in exchange for that? We get a paycheck.
Here's my question.
So there's an example of an exchange. Part of that paycheck involves paying taxes to the government for income. What do we get in exchange for that? Well, we get government services. We get police protection, we get schools, we get all kinds of stuff. We get roads. So I got kind of what I think is a fun little video here from Mr. Clifford. He, his big deal is putting these little videos together, economic terms, and relating them to movies. Everybody seen The Matrix? So that's what this one here is about. Let me pull up the right screen here. Just one second. You guys have seen Mr. Clifford before, I think, I hope. AC/DC economics is what he has called his website originally. He's not doing as many of these videos anymore. He's an AC/DC fan, obviously from his belt buckle, you can tell that. But he's also a movie fan, and he teaches AP Advanced Placement Economics. So he's a good guy to check out. He's got a whole system of videos out from the last several years. I've used him a lot in this class.
Welcome to AC/DC Econ. Today I'm going to show you something that's all around you that most people don't even see. It's called the Matrix, and you're inside it right now. The circular flow matrix or model shows how products, resources, and money flow in the economy. Now look at your surroundings. Seriously, take a moment and look around you. The matrix is everywhere.
It is all around us, even now in this very room.
In a market economy, there's households, which is just people like you and me. And there's also businesses. Now, businesses sell goods and services to the household in something called the product market. It's not like just one place. It's anywhere things are sold, like online or the mall or the street corner, anywhere you can buy stuff. The computer or phone in front of you right now is a great example. I mean, you didn't produce that. A business did, and they sold it to you in the product market. The same thing applies to your chair or pencil or the book over there, everything around you. But to make those goods and services, businesses need resources like workers and machines. In the free market, households own the resources and they're sold to the businesses in the resource market. Economists point out that there's 4 categories of resources or 4 factors of production. The first one is land, which is any natural resource or anything that comes from Mother Nature. Then there's labor, then capital, which is tools and machines. And finally, someone to bring it all together, the entrepreneur. That's why it's called the circular flow matrix. Those resources are being used by the business to produce the products that people turn around and go buy. Now, what about money? Well, it goes the other direction. When you buy your phone in the product market, you had to pay them money. That's called consumer spending. Now, that money makes its way to the businesses, and they call it revenue. But the business doesn't get to keep all that money. They've got to pay for resources, and that's called the cost of production. It's being paid to engineers that develop the phone. Those engineers earn income. Economists break down income into 4 different types that go along with each of the 4 factors of production. They're called factor payments. When you sell land, you earn rent. When you sell labor, you earn wages. For capital, you get interest. And for entrepreneurship, you get profit. So this is it, the circular flow matrix that shows how a market economy works. Whoa. Now, let me ask you a few questions to see if you really understand the matrix. First question, is your local mall an example of the product market or the resource market? It's both. Some people are there to buy products in the product market, but there's some people who are working or trying to get a job, and that's the resource market. So products, resources, and money are all being exchanged. Okay, next question. Do businesses demand or supply? The answer is both. They demand in the resource market, but they supply in the product market. Households, on the other hand, demand in the product market and they supply in the resource market. So both businesses and households are supplying and demanding. So far, this model is showing the private sector with just households and businesses. But there's a bunch of important things missing, like national defense, schools, and roads. Those things aren't produced by businesses. So let's add in the government and the public sector. The size and role of the government in the economy depends on a country's economic system, but in most market economies, the government still plays a role. First, the government buys goods and services from businesses in the product market, for example, fire trucks. And just like households, they pay for them. That's called government spending. The government also buys resources in the resource market, like teachers and firefighters. Again, it pays for those resources, which is again called government spending. The government then turns around and provides public goods and services like fire protection, schools, roads, and bridges to businesses and households. The government also pays money to businesses called subsidies or households called welfare. Economists call those transfer payments. There are situations when the government's giving out money, but not for goods and services. It's to meet some other objectives, like to alleviate poverty or get companies to produce more fuel-efficient cars. But how does the government afford to provide public goods and welfare and subsidies? Well, they tax businesses and households. Income taxes and sales taxes fund government projects and programs. Now, there's several things still missing from this matrix, including a financial sector where money isn't spent, it's saved and then loaned out, and also the role of other countries with exports and imports. But for now, this diagram gives you a pretty good idea of how the modern economy works. One final thought. In the movie, the Matrix enslaves people.
You are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage.
Many people wonder if capitalism and this hamster wheel of constantly spending and earning and spending and earning enslaves people. Now, would your life be better off if you pulled a Thoreau and just lived out in the woods? I don't know, but what I do know is there's a lot of things you'd have to live without. First, there'd be no cell phones or computers, so say goodbye to YouTube. And also, there'd be no modern medicine or hospitals. It would be nice if none of us had to work, but there's a trade-off to that. So does the Matrix enslave us or liberate us? Let me know in the comments below, all right? Thanks for watching. Till next time.
Okay, a couple of things I want to try to point out here about this video. When he says pull a Thoreau and go live in the woods, and this book comes flashing in on the screen, I don't know if anybody knows who Henry David Thoreau is. He is a famous author. He he went and lived in the woods on Walden Pond for a year and wrote about it, totally separate from society. You talk about living off the grid, that's what he did. So Walden was the place that he stayed. And then, you know, he had to be totally self-sufficient. And this was back in the 1800s, in the 19th century. So, you know, he was hunting and fishing and doing all those sorts of things on his own. Didn't have, it wasn't anything that we would recognize today as modern at that point in time. But Clifford's point here is, if you don't recognize the reference, you know, we're not going to go live off the grid. We're not going to live out in the woods somewhere. We still have to be a part of society. The other thing I want to point out is his graphic. This is a very common way that the circular flow is represented. Now, there's a couple of things that are missing, and he talks about all those in another video. You know, where do you put investing? Where does the stock market fit into all of this? Where do you put savings? When people save money, you know, it goes into a bank loans it out for other people to do stuff with. You know, that's part of our fractional reserve banking system. So some of those are those types of things are called leakage, because it's money was in the economy, and then now it's kind of in a different part of the economy. Maybe it's doing something, maybe it's not. And he mentioned in here also the whole idea of imports and exports. You know, where is this money coming from? If you're only talking about the United States economy, a lot of our money is going out of our economy to other countries because of the trade deficit that we have. So there's a lot of different pieces to this whole idea of circular flow. Anybody have comments or questions so far? Yeah, I mentioned before that Mr. Clifford's got a lot of different types of videos that he's produced over the years. He's easy to find. Jacob Clifford is his name. These are excellent supplements to what we're doing in here in class. So if you can't find, or you're not getting enough information on a particular topic, this is a good guy to go check out. There's lots and lots of videos out there, and he's been a teacher for years. So this is his job. This is part of what he's produced over the years that he's been a teacher. So check him out. You know, in math class, I recommend Khan Academy quite a bit. Here in financial foundations, Mr. Clifford gets the props because he's out there putting this information out. And we're going to look at a couple more of these videos here in a little bit when he talks about supply and demand. So I'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, so if we're talking more about the circular flow, this is material that will populate into your Google Classroom accounts today. Here you got kind of a simplified version of what Mr. Clifford was just talking about. You got households, businesses, and government involved in this circular flow. You know, resources go one direction, payments and income goes the other. Here's the direct link here to that YouTube video from Mr. Clifford that we were just watching, if you want to check it out on your own. And why is this important? Well, this circular flow, this idea has been around forever. But what we're looking at here are, in theory, different types of economies throughout the world. The first one is one that people would typically call a traditional economy. Every economy, no matter how you describe it, it's got the same basic decisions to make. Who decides what to produce? Who's in charge, basically? Who makes the decisions about use of resources? Where are people going to go work? Where is everybody putting their resources and their effort? So you got that question, who decides what to produce? You also have the question of who decides how to produce whatever those goods and services are. So somebody just popped in here with a name I don't recognize. Can you?
Is that him?
I'm sorry? Say that again? So every economy's got those two key decisions to make. Can you think of any examples of economies that might look like traditional economies? Traditional economy is generally characterized by basic subsistence kind of activities: hunting, fishing, farming, local trade, subsistence, sort of crafts work. You trade crafts, for instance, for other things. Historically, traditional economies is where everything starts. There are still parts of the world that practice traditional economies. They follow a traditional economy approach. If you're familiar with the Amish or the Mennonite communities, some of them don't even believe in using electricity. So they're getting around with bicycles and horse and buggy, and they're farmers or carpenters. There are some underdeveloped countries, some locations, tribal locations in various parts of the world that still follow traditional economy. So it's still out there. The market economy is what most people are familiar with. If you go back to the questions on the traditional economy, who decides what to produce and who decides how to produce it? Well, it's up to the individuals. Their economy and their reach is so small that the individuals get to make all those decisions. In a market economy, it's all about making profit. And it's the companies that decide what to produce and how to produce it. You know, if Ford Motor Company decides they want to put out a different type of vehicle, they can do that. So the employees are not going to tell them necessarily how to do something or where to build the factory or where to build the vehicles, or even potentially what they look like. The government's not going to tell Ford Motor Company what they have to do. In a market economy, if a company thinks that they can make money doing something, bringing a product to market, then they're free to go do that. So profit is the guiding principle with the market economy. And private ownership. Right? Because the government doesn't own Ford's factories. Stockholders own those factories. And usually a market economy is contrasted with this one, a command, or what's sometimes called a planned economy. China historically has followed that under communist rule. North Korea certainly would fit into that category today with the tight control that their government has over everything. So the answers to these two questions here for a planned or command economy, who decides what and who decides how to produce it? It's the government. The government decides what should be done, how it should be produced, and who's going to do it. I think my example I used before was with the Olympic Games in Beijing a few years ago. In China, Beijing has historically had a lot of air pollution. China mandated that factories in that area shut down for like a month before the Olympics so that the air would have a chance to clear out and it would look better on television. Can you imagine if in the United States, the government tried to shut down all the industries around the Olympic Games for pollution control so it looked better on television? It would never happen. The owners wouldn't stand for it. The people that work there would be up in arms. So command economy, the government has extensive control over the means of production and what's being produced. So how it's being produced and what's being produced. So the fourth type of economy is what some people call a mixed economy. And that's really what most of the world is these days. You know, there are some things even in the United States that might fall underneath a planned economy. For instance, all these vaccines that are being developed now, that's basically been, you know, almost a government mandate for some of the drug companies to come up with these things. Now they're going to get paid for all that. They're going to make money doing it. But that's their job. That's their business. China has even adopted a lot of market economy principles. Look at all the stuff that is made in China that's sold around the world. Look at all the products that we buy every day that says made in China. We don't get much of anything from North Korea because they are very, very insulated. They stick to themselves. Their leadership doesn't really want to have much to do with the rest of the outside world. And even traditional economies do still exist within a market economy structure, like the Mennonites, like the Amish. Their carpentry trade's a perfect example of a traditional economy still operating. People that want to work on the barter system, that would be a traditional, one of those elements of traditional economy. So those are the four types of economies that you should know about. Questions about any of those? Got some examples of the circular flow sort of in action. At some point, you're probably going to need to come up with some of your own examples. You know, first one here says households receive and consume goods and services produced by businesses. Okay, simple example. Joe gets a haircut. Joe goes out to eat at a restaurant. That's some services that are being produced by business that a household can take advantage of. And what happens in the exchange there? Think about how things are going back and forth between this person, Joe, and say the restaurant. They're going to pay for a meal. Where'd the restaurant get that food? They bought it from a distributor, from a farmer. So the farmer got paid in producing those goods for the restaurant to use. The restaurant got paid in providing the meal. The waitress or the waiter that served you is getting paid as part of their job. You maybe even left them a tip if they did a good job. Hopefully you did. So there's all kinds of exchanges going on in both directions. Even when you pay your bill at the end of the evening, you're leaving the restaurant. It's not just the amount of the food cost. What's the government get out of that transaction? Typically, they're going to get sales tax. That's added on at the cash register. When that employee, that waiter, or that waitress gets their paycheck every couple of weeks. What's the government get out of that? They get some tax money. They get income taxes paid. They get Medicare. They get FICA. They get Social Security paid. So even what appears to be a relatively simple transaction is still part of this whole circular flow thing. So you can come up with as many examples as you can imagine, just by thinking about those connections, those relationships. So any questions about the circular flow? Now we're going to start talking about supply and demand. It's one of the most basic concepts in all of economics. So you can see right at the top of this sheet, it says, how does supply and demand affect the price of a good or service? Well, anybody want to chime in on that? In a market-based society where there's no subsidies, now there are subsidies that the government pays to keep prices at a certain level on some products that are necessary for better health, for instance, like milk. So typically, though, think about what happens a lot of Christmas shopping seasons. The new Xbox coming out. What happens? Seems like every year people line up. They want to be the first to get those when they come online, when they're available. You go down and camp out at Best Buy to get that first one when the doors open. So that's an indicator of demand. People want, it's not that I demand to have this Xbox. Demand is just a recognition that some people want a product. That's the demand. Now, the producers of Xbox, they've made some estimates already on how many of those they think they should produce. They know what their profit is that they're looking for. So do they always produce enough to meet the demand? Nope. Right. That's right. Somebody in here said no. Well, and the reason for that is because when the demand is high and the supply is low, the price can go up. They can charge more. Right below this thing, it talks about diamonds and being 25 cents a piece. Well, how many would you buy? I don't know. If they're $500, how many would you buy? Well, I probably wouldn't buy any of the ones that are 25 cents because they're not very valuable. If I wanted diamonds, I would want some that are valuable. Any product goes through the same sort of thing. Every business does that sort of calculation. They're looking at the demand, what they think the demand will be when they put that product out there in the market, and what they think they can sell it for, how many they should supply to meet the profit. So there's an essential couple of relationships here that are really critical to. And the key on all of this, you can't talk about supply and demand without also talking about price. They are integrally related. Supply and the demand and price all affect each other. Because what happens if Microsoft puts that Xbox out there and they price it too high? There might be a lot of, there was initial demand for it, but if it's priced too high, maybe not as many people are going to buy it. So then they've supplied too many and they're going to have to bring the price down. So you can gel this relationship down essentially into a couple of different statements. If you have low supply and high demand, typically the price can go up. That's why when you do see that, I don't want anybody to think I'm picking on Microsoft or on Xbox as a product, but it happens a lot. You see these kind of things at Christmas. People, the demand is so high that people will wait in line or get them ordered online. They'll buy 2 or 3, and then they'll turn right around and put them on eBay at an inflated price to try to make money themselves, resell it brand new. And because there's a low supply, people have a high demand for a product. They can raise the price. They can do that. They can make money doing that. That's our market economy at work. The opposite of this, high supply, low demand, typically involves low prices. Now that's what happens sometimes when you see these fad, you get some popular item, it was a high demand for it. Everybody had to have one. So the company went out and they produced a whole bunch of them and they brought them to market. And 2 or 3 weeks later, suddenly, oh, there's some new fad. We don't care about that thing anymore. We're going to go off to the next thing. And now the company has created a whole bunch of stuff that nobody wants. If you remember a few years ago, a product called Silly Bands that were rubber bands that were in animal shapes and you wear them as wristbands and stuff. And those were, yeah, that's what I mean. It's been a few years, but it was a product that was hugely popular. But it was a fad. The popularity it was popular with kids. And they were banned from school in elementary. Oh, see, that's a reflection of demand. Kids getting in fights over Silly Bands. The demand is out of control at that point. And before long, parents were saying, "No, you can't buy those. Don't bring those into this house again. If you do that, I'm going to throw them away." And of course, what happened to the demand? It went down extremely fast. So now you go to Big Lots, you can still buy those things, but they're cheap. They're everywhere. And that's I use Big Lots a lot as my example also of things that were overproduced or overpriced, and a company that missed the mark on estimating the demand. They made too much of something or they didn't price it right. And so now they're not going to just let it sit in a warehouse. They got production costs tied up in that product, whatever it is. They're going to sell it and get something for it. They're going to try to get some money back for it. So if you're a business, some revenue is better than no revenue, even if you have to write off part of it as a loss. That's what accounting people are trained to figure out. And pretty much every business that makes a product has somebody crunching numbers thinking, okay, what's the demand for this product? How much can we charge for it? What does it cost us to produce it? How much money can we make? And they're creating these graphs. They're creating supply and demand graphs. And they're trying to estimate something that's called equilibrium. You guys familiar with equilibrium? Know that term? Equilibrium. It's used in economic terms, but it's also used in healthcare.
Does it mean off balance or balanced?
Balanced, yes. Thank you. Balanced is equilibrium. And if your doctor, if you go in with you've fallen down and you got dizzy, you could tell your doctor you lost your equilibrium. You lost your balance, fell down. In economic terms, the equilibrium is that graphing spot. And I'll show you some graphs here in a minute. This is what businesses are always trying to come up to. They want to hit the market with the product at exactly the right price that's going to meet the demand perfectly, so they don't have any leftovers or they're not a shortage, and so they can sell everything that they produce and make the profit that they estimate. That's like the sweet spot of estimates. You got the right price, the right product that meets the demand perfectly. You're at the equilibrium between the supply and the demand. And the price is part of that equation, because you can be in disequilibrium if you price it too high or you don't put enough of them out on the market. So I want to go back to a couple of Mr. Clifford videos now that will talk about some of this graphing and how the supply and the demand stuff actually works. Okay, here's Mr. Clifford again with another one of his econ movies.
Hey, how you doing, students? This is Mr. Clifford. Welcome to Econ Movies. Today we're going to look at the economics in Indiana Jones. As you know, Dr. Jones isn't an economist. He's an archaeologist.
We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot.
Sounds pretty boring. Let's look at one of the most important concepts in all of economics: demand and supply. It all starts with buyers and sellers.
You bring me no answer.
Mr. Hodge is a real small guy.
They come together to negotiate a price that works for both of them. The buyer wants to pay the lowest price possible, but the seller doesn't have to accept that offer.
The diamond, Lal. The deal was for the diamond.
Now, if the buyer really wants that product, he's going to have to increase the price to something that the seller is willing to take. In this example, it's just one buyer and one seller. When you start analyzing multiple buyers and sellers, then you're looking at markets. To understand markets, Indiana Jones needs to find somebody to teach him demand and supply. To learn about demand and supply, let's pick a market that we can analyze. So let's pick something like pet snakes.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Let's start with demand. To have demand, buyers must be willing and able to buy pet snakes. Now, obviously, some people like pet snakes and some people don't.
There's a big snake in the flames! Oh, that's just one pet snake, Reggie! I hate snakes, Chuck! I hate them!
When the price is really high, let's say $100 for a pet snake, people don't want to buy very many snakes. In this case, only 10 would be purchased. After all, there's a bunch of substitute pets you could buy instead. You could buy a pet tarantula, a pet elephant, or a pet camel.
No camels.
Okay, no camels, no camels. If the price was lower for snakes, consumers would be willing and able to buy more snakes. In this case, if the price is down at 2, then consumers would want to buy 300. So this downward sloping demand curve shows you the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. The supply curve, on the other hand, is upward sloping. It takes time, energy, and money to breed, raise, and sell pet snakes. At a low price, sellers wouldn't want to sell very many snakes because it's not profitable. So at a low price of 2, the quantity supplied would only be 10 snakes. At a high price of $100, Sellers would have more incentive to bring a bunch of snakes to the market. Now we're finally there. It's time to put demand and supply together.
X marks the spot.
Let's analyze this graph. At a low price of 2, the quantity demanded, the amount buyers want to buy, will be a lot higher than the quantity supplied. At that price, buyers would want to buy 300, but sellers would only want to sell 10. This is called a shortage. If the price is up here at 100, then sellers would want to sell a bunch of snakes, but the buyers would only want to buy a few of them. This is called a surplus. At $20, the quantity demand equals the quantity supplied. So there's no shortage and there's no surplus. This is called equilibrium. Equilibrium is like the holy grail of supply and demand.
That's typical carpenter.
Now you understand the graph and equilibrium, but we're not done. The supply and demand graph is a great tool for figuring out what's going to happen when there's a change in a market. For example, let's say that snakes and monkeys are substitute pets.
Where did this animal come from?
Now assume that the price of pet monkeys falls. How will this affect the price and quantity of pet snakes? It doesn't affect the supply curve for pet snakes at all. It affects the demand. Consumers that would normally buy pet snakes would now turn around and go buy more pet monkeys because their price is cheaper. This would decrease the demand for pet snakes, shifting the demand curve to the left. At every possible price, people are buying less pet snakes because they're buying monkeys instead. The graph shows the new equilibrium and the fact that the price and quantity will fall. Wait, why? Why does the price go down? After the demand curve shifted to the left, what would happen if sellers kept trying to sell snakes at the old equilibrium of $20? There would be a surplus. There'd be way more snakes out in the market that consumers want to buy. Sellers would compete with each other because they want to get rid of all these excess snakes, which would drive the price down to the new equilibrium. Did you get that? Let's show a change again, except this time, assume the people in this market have a pest control problem.
Oh, rats.
When people go to the pet store, they figure, let's get a pet that can help us get rid of the rats. What will happen to the demand for pet snakes? If you said increase or shift to the right,
You have chosen wise.
the graph shows the new equilibrium and says the price and the quantity will both go up. Why does the price go up? After the demand curve shifted to the right, now the quantity demanded is way greater than the quantity supplied. This is a shortage. Consumers want more pet snakes so they can eat the rats, but the sellers are running out of pet snakes to sell. Competition between buyers would bid up the price of snakes and give sellers more of an incentive to bring more to the market. Price would go up, quantity would go up. Understanding these markets is actually pretty easy because it's just the collective behavior of buyers and sellers. In the end, I don't think Indiana Jones would want to buy a pet snake or a pet monkey. I think he'd prefer a dog.
We named the dog Indiana. Oh, you are named after the dog?
Okay, a couple of things I want to go back and make sure you
The
guys
supply and demand graph is a great tool.
are familiar with what goes into some of this, because you got to be able to recognize these graphs when you see them, what they mean. And yeah, that's where I want to go. If you notice this, when he said there's an inverse relationship between price and demand. When I wrote high supply, low demand, low price, well, that's how these are going to be reflected on this kind of a graph. He's got D here to represent the demand curve. The demand curve always goes in this direction, because when the price is high, when it's up here at $100, whatever the product is, the number that you have to worry about selling is very low because not many people can afford to pay that much. The other thing I want to point out about this kind of a graph is that price is always on the y-axis, or always on the left. Quantity, how many are being made available, is always on the bottom. So price and quantity are the two things that are always shown on a supply and demand graph. Where's the next one? So this next section here, he's talking about adding the supply into the graph. The supply graph goes the other direction. You talk about these as being curves. They're showing the demand as curved. The supply line doesn't really look that curved. But most of the time with these kind of graphs, it's not a straight line, because you've got, you know, if you're looking at a big market of products, you've got hundreds of places selling them for slightly different prices, and the demand's going to be different, and people are selling them at different numbers, different quantities, etc. So these supply and demand lines end up sort of being averages a lot of times. When I mentioned before that sweet spot that the producers are trying to hit is the equilibrium, that's this spot right here where the two graph lines cross. And you got to remember also that the supply line always goes up to the right. When the cost is low, the quantity of supply is going to be low. So if you look on the price side over here, when the price is high, the people that are producing stuff, they want to produce more. May not sell them all, but that's their incentive. So this kind of X crossing of the graph is something that you will see again and again. And it's the way economists have generally recognized the analysis that's necessary for to figure out if people have what the demand is and how much somebody can price something at, and whether or not the demand has been met. So there's two other concepts I'm going to add to this other graphic. Surplus. You need to know what a surplus is. Surplus, that's all the stuff they missed. They priced it too high, or they made too many. That's all the stuff that goes to big lots. Or surplus. Yeah, if you're from Ohio or you're from out east, and you might be familiar with a company called Gabriel's. It's a big discounter. Big Lots is a discounter. They buy everybody's overstock. They get all the stuff that people have made too much of or they price too high. That's a surplus. That's extra. They couldn't sell it at the price they wanted to make a profit, so they put a deep discount on it and sell it all truckloads full to those other companies to resell. So that's the overestimate. On the other side is more like what happens a lot with the Xbox scenario. There's a shortage. They didn't make enough. Sometimes they do that on purpose. Sometimes it's by accident, you know. Sometimes companies are going along, they're producing something and they're happy at the production level, and suddenly their item becomes extremely popular and they can't keep up with the demand. I think you could even argue that during this pandemic recently with the vaccines, there's been a shortage of the vaccine because the demand is so high and the producers can't come up with it fast enough. I mean, it's being made available free to everyone that wants to get the vaccine, but the government is still paying for it. Somebody's paying for that. The drug companies aren't doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They're still going to make money doing it. And it's been a shortage because they can't produce it fast enough to meet the demand. So equilibrium, surplus, and shortage are all three terms that you really need to know in connection with the whole idea of supply and demand graphs. Anybody have questions about those? I'm going to give you one other graphic here that's a little cleaner. This is probably, this would be the traditional or the classic way to show that supply and demand are at equilibrium. And again, you can see prices over here on the left. The little p there stands for price. Q stands for quantity on the bottom. The purple line is the supply line. That's how much is being produced. The green line is the demand line. And right where they cross, that's what you call equilibrium. That's what the producers are wanting to hit. In fact, the other thing about equilibrium that probably needs to be talked about more is not only are the producers happy, but the consumers are happy too, because they're able to get the product they want at a price that they're willing to pay. So the companies are making profit, they're happy. They've sold everything that they estimated they'd be able to sell at the right price. Consumers are happy because they were able to buy what they wanted. So if I go back to this other handout here, the law of demand. Well, it's not really a law. Congress didn't pass it. You know, they talk about the laws of nature. Those aren't written down anywhere. The law of demand, though, generally has been developed to explain what happens in the marketplace. So this graphic just focuses on the demand side of the transaction. High price, low demand. Low demand, low price. Excuse me, I said that backwards, didn't I? High price, low demand. High demand, low price. When stuff is priced lower, people tend to want more of it, unless it's just not a good product. Again, that's that inverse relationship. On the supply side, you want to talk about the law of supply, it's exactly the opposite. Because now you're talking about the producers. Well, if the price is low, they don't want to produce very many because they can't make much money, or maybe they even lose money. They want to produce and price things at the high side here where they know they can make money. That's because that's their main goal as a business. So there's some questions on this handout that I think are good for you to look at. What are the two categories of items that will be graphed? Well, the two things that go on the graph are price and quantity. Price and quantity. Which one goes on the x-axis? That's going to test your recollection of algebra a little bit, yeah? What, say again? Quantity? No, the x-axis is the horizontal axis. This question is about the label that you put on your graph. The labels here are the same, whether you're talking about the supply graph or the demand graph. Price is on the left, quantity is on the right. The quantity, this is the x-axis. Remember from algebra, the xy coordinate plane? This is only quadrant 1 because all these numbers are positive. This is the x-axis, this is the y-axis. Quantity goes on the x-axis. Price goes on the other. You have to know whether the supply curve slopes up or down and whether the demand curve slopes up or down, and what the graph will look like when they're both graphed together. Okay, can everybody see this now? Supply and demand lesson? No, probably not.
Yes, I was.
Good, good. All right, there we go. Anybody recognize what this woman over here is doing on the left? What are those things that she's got around her?
The hula hooping.
Yeah, she's hula hooping. Those were extremely popular back in the 50s, maybe even into the early 60s. Now, over here on the right, if you look at this woman's wrists, what's she wearing? Brianna? Oh, okay. She's got those silly bands on. I guess this is Shakira. I don't know who Shakira is. I'm not into that sort of thing. But if she's wearing the silly bands, could that be a reason why lots of people wanted to go out and buy them? Possibly.
Maybe, but I was in like second or third grade.
Okay. So you didn't, if you were only in second and third grade, you're probably begging your parents to buy them for you whenever they went to the store. So this whole sheet here is all about your own personal experience. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Anybody have an example of something that you wanted really, really bad when you were growing up? Just something that you wanted really bad. For me, it was a Stingray bicycle. You know, back then they were probably 50 bucks a piece. I wouldn't have been able to buy it. I couldn't buy it. I never got it, but it would have been nice to have. And so if you think back to some item like that that was really in high demand, did you pay a fair price for it? What's it worth now? There's sort of the classic example of the Sesame Street character Elmo. Anybody ever have a Tickle Me Elmo doll? Tickle Me Elmo. It was a craze. People wanted these dolls really bad. Beanie Babies, Cabbage Patch dolls. Every year it seems like there's something new. Webkins? Okay. I don't even have any idea what that is. Oh, stuffed animals? Okay. So here was what the Tickle Me Elmo doll looked like. And little kids loved them. I mean, you can get them for 10 bucks now. You literally, you tickle the thing and he laughs. But here's what was happening years ago. This was one of those fads I'm talking about, like silly bands or pet rocks, anything that's in
Red
huge
furry
demand.
doll that giggles a lot. Tickle Me Elmo is the hottest thing this Christmas. Sold out of stores everywhere. But is it all just marketing and media hype? Here's Jeffrey Kaufman on Elmo Mania.
No wonder he's laughing. All the way to the bank, because North America has been gripped by Tickle Me Elmo hysteria.
Oh, boy, that's tickle.
Just ask them in Fredericton, where 48 of the bug-eyed beasts were put on sale at a local Walmart. And one of the clerks was sent to hospital after being trampled in the frenzy.
Somebody in the crowd yelled, "There's the Elmos," and they rushed us.
Or check out your local paper. It's probably crammed with ads from Elmo profiteers. This Montreal woman had an offer of $330. She's holding out for $500. Not bad for a $35 investment.
Times are tough right now, so you gotta do what you can to survive.
Yes, there are other Elmos available, keeping the rest of the Sesame Street gang company on store shelves. But if tickling's your fancy, you're out of luck. What have you got there?
Not what I wanted. Close, but not good enough.
What's the big deal about Tickle Me Elmo?
Actually, my daughter probably wouldn't know the difference, but it's actually I've seen it. That's the cutest thing I've ever seen.
This is Sailor Moon, and this is our largest doll category. Toy makers dream of such consumer obsession. Elmo is produced by Tyco. Irwin Toys, a competitor, has had its share of blockbusters.
Sometimes the best laid plans never happen, and in some cases, the unexpected happens. I don't think there's any question that Elmo is one of these unexpected, pleasant things that happen to toy companies now and then.
How cute and huggy.
To some, though, all this tickle talk is more than a tad nauseating.
Parents become desperate. We hear desperation in their voice, like, where can I get it? Well, I don't know where you can get it. Move on, choose something else. But there aren't so many choices. It's like saying, this is the best. Well, it isn't the best. I mean, there's nothing, a toy, how can any toy be the best? I mean, it's a toy.
But don't be deceived by that laughter. There might be some tears in there, too. Because for all the money the manufacturers have made, they could have made millions more if they hadn't underestimated demand.
Oh, yeah, that's tickle.
Jeffrey Kaufman, CBC News, Toronto.
Only pay for what you need with Liberty Mutual.
Okay, so that's what Tickle Me Elmo is all about. 25 years ago, and there were people, obviously the situation's different then than now. They were advertising them for sale for $500 or $1,000 or whatever. Now you can get them for $10. So that's the kind of thing that can happen with demand and supply over time, and you can see the direct reflection in the price. So I figured you guys probably too young to remember any of that, or maybe weren't even around when that was going on. But my son was 8 years old in 1996, and I don't think we were able to find the Tickle Me Elmo because it was definitely being asked for. So that's it for today, guys. We're out of time. I'll be around tomorrow if you need help, and Monday, so let me know. Appreciate everybody being here today. Keep working.